A packed courthouse buzzed with tense murmurs. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of justice looming over the room like an unspoken force. In the grand halls of the Baltimore courthouse, where the country's most critical cases were debated, one moment of arrogance, one moment of sheer ignorance, was about to change everything. A police officer, tall, broad-shouldered, with a demeanor that screamed authority, stood guard at the entrance of the courtroom. His uniform was pressed, his badge gleamed under the fluorescent lighting, and his hand rested instinctively on the belt that held his weapon. His gaze, sharp and scrutinizing, flickered to every person walking through the doors. Then, she appeared. A black woman, poised and confident, making her way toward the courtroom doors. She walked with certainty, dressed in a tailored black suit, heels clicking against the marble floor. She had seen that look before, the one the officer gave her the second she approached. It was the look of someone who had already decided who she was before she even opened her mouth. The moment she tried to pass through, his arm shot out, blocking her path. "Hold it right there." His voice was thick with authority, laced with something colder, something uglier. His eyes scanned her up and down, his lips curling into something dangerously close to amusement. "What do you think you're doing?" She blinked at him, unfazed, and reached into her bag. "I'm here for court proceedings," he scoffed before she could finish. "Yeah, I don't think so. I don't know what you're trying to pull, lady, but this isn't where you belong. You lost. Jury duty's over there. Or are you here for a case? Defendant? Witness?" His smirk deepened, but there was no humor in it. Just a quiet, simmering disdain. She exhaled slowly, gripping the folder in her hands a little tighter. "Step aside, officer." His eyes darkened. He stepped forward, towering over her. "You got some attitude, don't you? Who the hell do you think you're talking to?" He let out a sharp chuckle, shaking his head. "Listen, lady, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm not letting you waltz in here like you own the place. You understand me? You people think you can just, you people," she echoed, her voice calm, controlled, but sharp enough to slice through the thick, suffocating air between them. His jaw clenched. He had said too much, but he was too deep in his own arrogance to back down now. "You know exactly what I mean," he muttered, voice dropping just low enough to be threatening. Then, in a move so quick that the bystanders barely had time to process, he grabbed her by the arm, his grip tight, his authority unchallenged, or so he thought. "You're not stepping 1 foot inside this courtroom. You hear me?" A gasp rippled through the hallway. Several people turned to look, whispers rising like a storm brewing on the horizon. Her breath hitched for only a second before she pulled back, yanking her arm free. "Let me go," she demanded, her voice still even, still controlled. The officer, unfazed, reached for the radio clip to his shoulder. "I got a situation at the entrance." "Got a trespasser refusing to," a sharp, clipped voice interrupted him. "What in God's name is going on here?" A senior court clerk, a white man in his 60s, stormed toward them, his face twisted in something between confusion and horror. The officer turned, standing tall, exuding confidence. "I was just handling a situation, sir. This woman was trying to enter without permission." No identification, no clearance, the clerk's face twisted further, this time in disbelief. Then, as if a light bulb had gone off in his mind, his expression drained of color. You don't know who she is?" His voice trembled slightly. The officer frowned, glancing at the woman again. The realization still hadn't struck him. The clerk stepped aside, extending a hand toward her. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. I had no idea you hadn't been escorted in yet." The officer's expression flickered with confusion. Then, he noticed the way everyone else was looking at her. Not like an intruder. Not like someone who had no place here. But with a quiet, palpable respect. And then, the weight of the moment crashed down like a tidal wave. The silence stretched unbearably. Then, her voice sliced through it like a blade. "I am the presiding judge of this court, officer. And you just put your hands on me." The word struck like lightning. The officer's face drained of color. The breath caught in his throat. The murmurs in the hall exploded into a storm of whispers and gasps. Phones were already out, recording. The tension was suffocating. For the first time, the officer stumbled over his words. You're the judge." His voice was barely a whisper, but the horror in his eyes screamed louder than anything he could say. She straightened her blazer, brushing off the invisible weight of his touch, but the fire in her eyes remained. "Yes. And I think we need to have a serious conversation about your place in this courthouse." The officer stood frozen, every ounce of power he thought he had slipping through his fingers. And what happened next left everyone speechless. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice. This channel is a space where powerful stories expose hard truths and celebrate resilience. To every Black viewer watching, you matter. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Tonight, we bring you a tale of justice, redemption, and an unexpected twist that will leave you speechless. Stay with us, and if you support stories that challenge injustice and uplift powerful voices, hit that subscribe button now. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. Baltimore was a city of contradictions. A place where history and struggle intertwined like the cracked pavement on its streets. A city that echoed with the ghosts of civil rights battles while still bleeding from fresh wounds of injustice. It was a city where a name could carry weight, where a reputation could determine whether doors were slammed in your face or held open with reverence. And for Judge Aisha Carter, that reality had shaped every step of her journey. Born and raised on the west side of Baltimore, Aisha knew what it meant to fight for a place in a world that didn't always want to make room. The daughter of a school teacher and a former steelworker, she had grown up watching her parents navigate a system that seemed determined to keep them in their place. Her father, once a proud man who had worked the steel mills until they shut down, spent years searching for work that would provide for his family. Her mother, a fierce woman with a spine of steel, had spent decades in underfunded classrooms, pushing children who had been written off by society to believe they were more than their circumstances. Aisha had been one of those children. She had felt the weight of expectation, the burden of proving herself over and over again. School had been her battleground, the place where she sharpened her mind like a weapon, where she learned that knowledge could be the great equalizer. She had excelled, fought for scholarships, and left Baltimore to attend Howard University before pushing herself through Harvard Law. And then, against the odds, she had returned home, determined to carve out a space in the very system that had tried to keep people like her out. By the time she was appointed as the youngest Black female judge in Baltimore's history, she had already spent years fighting. As a public defender, she had stood beside men and women who had been discarded by a broken system, people who had been given no second chances. As a prosecutor, she had fought against corruption, standing firm even when it meant making enemies. And now, as a judge, she carried the weight of that responsibility every time she stepped into her courtroom. The courthouse itself was an imposing structure, massive marble columns, high ceilings, the air always a few degrees colder than necessary. It was a place designed to make people feel small, to remind them of the power it wielded. And yet, Aisha had never let that intimidate her. She walked through its halls with the same quiet authority she had carried all her life. She belonged here, no matter how many people still looked at her like she didn't. And there were plenty of those people. She had learned to recognize them by the way their eyes lingered a second too long, by the way their lips pressed into thin lines when she spoke, by the way they questioned her rulings more than they ever had her white counterparts. She had learned to ignore it, to push past the whispers and the quiet condescension. But there were times, rare moments, when the weight of it settled on her shoulders like a lead cloak. Officer Daniel Briggs was one of those people. A veteran of the Baltimore Police Department, Briggs had been on the force for over 15 years. He was the kind of cop that younger officers looked up to, not because of his skill or leadership, but because he carried himself with the kind of arrogance that came from knowing he would always get away with things. He had been accused of excessive force more times than anyone could count, had complaints filed against him that mysteriously disappeared before they ever made it to a formal review. He was the kind of cop who believed that power was meant to be wielded with a heavy hand, that respect was something taken, not earned. He had spent years patrolling the streets of Baltimore, seeing the same faces, the same neighborhoods, and developing the same quiet resentment that so many men like him carried. He had watched the city change, had seen more black officers rise through the ranks, had seen black politicians take seats once reserved for white men like himself. And he had hated every second of it. To him, Judge Carter was just another example of the world turning upside down. Another reminder that things weren't the way they used to be. So when he saw her walking toward the courtroom that morning, he hadn't hesitated. He hadn't thought, hadn't questioned, hadn't considered for even a second that she was anything other than what he assumed her to be. Just another woman stepping into a space that wasn't hers. He had stopped her, planted himself in her path, and spoken to her the way he had spoken to so many others before. With authority. With condescension. With the deep, unshakable belief that he was in the right. But Aisha had not been like the others. She had not cowered, had not stumbled over apologies or explanations. She had stood firm, unshaken, as if she had expected this moment, as if she had been preparing for it her entire life. And then, with the weight of an entire courtroom watching, she had revealed the truth. Briggs had felt the floor shift beneath him, had felt the slow, creeping horror settle into his bones as the realization dawned. He had put his hands on a judge. A sitting judge. In her own courthouse. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, believing that no matter what he did, no matter how far he pushed, there would be no consequences. But for the first time, standing there in that hallway, surrounded by the weight of what he had done, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. And as the murmurs around him grew louder, as the cameras started rolling, as Aisha Carter fixed him with a look that promised reckoning, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This time, he wouldn't get away with it. The air inside the courthouse was thick with an unsettling silence, the kind that settled in the moments after something irreversible had just occurred. Tension hung in the corridors like an electric charge, spreading through the walls, vibrating in the marble floors, making its way into every crevice of the building. It was as if the entire structure was holding its breath, waiting, watching, absorbing the weight of the moment. The people who had witnessed it, court employees, attorneys, defendants, security personnel, even those who were simply there for unrelated hearings, had frozen in place, their eyes darting between each other, their minds scrambling to comprehend what they had just seen. No one moved. No one spoke. The courthouse, normally a cacophony of voices, shuffling feet, slamming doors, and the ever-present hum of justice grinding forward, had become a vacuum of sound, a suspended moment in time where everything else ceased to matter. In the eye of the storm stood Officer Daniel Briggs, his face an unreadable mask of disbelief, his rigid stance betraying the battle waging inside him. His breathing had grown shallow, almost imperceptible, as though his body itself refused to acknowledge what had just unfolded. The realization of who he had just laid hands on, of what he had just done, was settling over him like a slow, suffocating weight, crushing him under its enormity. For years, for his entire career, he had operated under an unspoken truth: power belonged to men like him. It was not questioned, it was not challenged, it was not threatened. But now, in a single instant, with a single sentence, the foundation of that belief had cracked beneath him. He had overstepped. For the first time, he had crossed a line that he could not erase. The woman standing before him, the woman he had grabbed, shoved, humiliated in front of a courtroom full of people, was not some lost juror. She was not a witness mistakenly wandering into the wrong space. She was not a defendant awaiting her fate. She was not someone beneath his authority. No, she was the highest authority in this building. Judge Aisha Carter. The presiding judge of this very courtroom. The woman who, in that very moment, held more power than he could even begin to comprehend. The murmurs that had been building in hushed tones throughout the hallway were now rising, growing louder, more urgent, spiraling outward as people began whispering, texting, recording. Phones had already appeared in hands, capturing the scene, preserving it, spreading it beyond these walls, out into a world where there would be no undoing this mistake. Briggs' name, his actions, his arrogance, his downfall, it was all being documented in real time. He could feel it, like a suffocating blanket wrapping around him, squeezing the breath from his lungs. The power he had wielded so effortlessly just moments ago had been ripped from his grasp so violently that he could barely process the whiplash. And the worst part? There was nothing he could do to take it back. Judge Carter's expression was unreadable, a mask of carefully contained fury, the kind that didn't explode outward in reckless rage but instead simmered beneath the surface, burning hotter, more dangerously than anything loud or reactive. Her breathing was even, her posture unwavering, her gaze sharp enough to cut through steel. She was not rattled. She was not afraid. No, there was something else in her eyes, something far worse for Briggs than anger, certainty. The certainty that this was not over. The certainty that this moment had set something into motion that could not be stopped. The certainty that for the first time in his entire life, Daniel Briggs was going to face something he had spent his whole career avoiding, accountability. She let the silence stretch between them for a moment longer, let it sink in, let it fester. Then, with a voice that was quiet but razor-sharp, she spoke, sealing his fate. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. I want this officer removed from my courtroom. Now. The words sent a shockwave through the space, reverberating against the marble walls, collapsing the fragile illusion of control that Briggs had built for himself. His body went rigid, his breath hitched in his throat. Removed? His mind scrambled for an argument, an excuse, something, anything, to regain control. His lips parted, words fumbling at the edge of his tongue, but before he could speak, another voice cut in. Judge Carter, came a low, measured voice. Captain Mark Ellis. The ranking officer in the building, a man who had spent years walking the tightrope between loyalty to his men and the optics of keeping the department from collapsing under public scrutiny. He pushed his way forward through the gathered crowd, his eyes shifting between Aisha and Briggs, calculating, assessing. He had been around long enough to know when a situation was beyond repair. He knew damage control when he saw it, but even he wasn't sure if there was any salvaging this. He took a slow step forward, careful, measured, controlled. Your Honor, perhaps we should take this to, Aisha's gaze flickered toward him, and in an instant, he knew better. He stopped mid-sentence, swallowed hard. There would be no compromise. No quiet backroom discussion. No way to sweep this away. Escort him out, she repeated, her voice colder now, more final. Ellis hesitated only a fraction of a second before giving the slightest of nods. Briggs, he said, his tone firm but not unkind, though it carried the weight of an unspoken order. You need to step out. Now. Briggs' jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the humiliation, the disbelief, the rage. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He had spent his entire career dictating how situations like these played out. He was the one who gave orders, who demanded compliance, who decided who was in control and who wasn't. But now, standing in the middle of a courthouse full of watching eyes, being publicly stripped of that authority, he felt something he had not felt in years, helplessness. You can't be serious, he muttered, his voice low, gritted, barely controlled. He wasn't speaking to Ellis anymore. He was speaking to her. Judge Carter did not waver. She did not even blink. Step out. Ellis' voice was sharper now, absolute. For a moment, a long, excruciating moment, Briggs did not move. His entire body was stiff, every instinct inside him screaming to fight back, to push against the weight of the moment, to refuse the reality of what was happening. But there was no escape. He could feel it in the air, in the way the entire courthouse was waiting, in the way this moment was already bigger than him, bigger than anything he could control. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned on his heel and walked away. But he could feel it. The eyes on his back. The quiet judgment. The understanding that this was only the beginning. That this wasn't over. And as the doors shut behind him, as the weight of what had just transpired settled over the courthouse like an impending storm, one undeniable truth remained. The fall had begun. And what was coming next, would shake everything to its core. The courtroom was heavy with an air of inevitability, a suffocating weight pressing down on everyone present. The tension, unspoken yet deafening, crackled in the space between the wooden benches, coiled itself around the massive columns, and settled deep into the mahogany furniture that had borne witness to countless legal battles. But today, this was no ordinary proceeding. Today, justice was not just being debated, it was demanding to be seen, to be felt, to be enforced. At the front of the room, Judge Aisha Carter sat in her elevated chair, her posture poised but unyielding, her presence commanding. Every set of eyes in the courtroom was on her, waiting, watching. Some with admiration, some with unease, and others, like Daniel Briggs, with desperation disguised as defiance. The man who had once stood with unchecked arrogance, who had wielded his badge like an unassailable shield, now sat at the defendant's table, his face carved in stone, his fingers clenching the edge of the table as though it was the last solid thing he had left to hold on to. The irony of the moment was not lost on anyone. Not the attorneys. Not the jury. Not even the reporters who filled the back rows, their cameras poised, their pens scratching furiously, documenting every shift in expression, every word uttered. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. A moment that would not fade quietly into the history of this courthouse, but one that would ripple through the entire city, perhaps even further. Briggs had spent years believing in his own invincibility. Years of acting with impunity, certain that no one would ever hold him accountable. He had thought this, even as the walls had started to close in on him. Even as the evidence mounted. Even as, one by one, the people he had once dismissed as powerless stood up and spoke out. But this, sitting in a defendant's chair, staring up at the very woman he had tried to humiliate, this was never part of the equation. The prosecution had not wasted time dismantling every defense he had clung to. Footage of his aggression had surfaced. Not just from that day, but from years of unchecked misconduct. Victims, long silenced by fear and bureaucracy, had come forward. Testimonies had piled up like bricks, forming an unshakable wall around him. His name had become a symbol, but not the kind that men like him wanted to be remembered for. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Outside, protesters gathered, their chants a distant hum, their signs a visual reminder that the world was watching. Briggs shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening as the prosecutor's voice echoed through the chamber. This is not a case of misunderstanding. This is not a case of misinterpretation. This is a case of abuse. Of power wielded like a weapon against those deemed unworthy of basic dignity. And today, that power, the one the defendant has long relied on to shield himself, has been stripped away. The words cut through the room like a blade. Aisha remained silent, watching as the weight of it settled over Briggs. He had been in courtrooms before. Many times. But never like this. Never with his name on the docket. Never with his future in the hands of others. His attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, but Briggs barely heard him. His mind was stuck on a single truth: he had lost control. He had been stripped of the ability to dictate what happened next. And that, more than anything, terrified him. The prosecutor continued. Officer Briggs believed he was untouchable. That his badge placed him above the very laws he swore to uphold. But that is not how justice works. That is not how this courtroom operates. And today, he will see, we all will see, that no one is above the law. Briggs felt his breath grow shallow. His throat was dry, his hands clammy. He had told himself, over and over, that this wouldn't go this far. That the system, his system, would find a way to protect him, just as it always had. But this time was different. The evidence was too strong. The public pressure too high. And worst of all, the person standing in judgment of him was the same woman he had once tried to silence. Aisha finally leaned forward, breaking the stillness she had held for so long. "Officer Briggs," she said, her voice controlled, yet filled with undeniable authority. "You sit before this court today accused of a crime that speaks to something much deeper than one moment of misconduct. It speaks to a pattern. A pattern of abuse, of disregard for the very principles you claim to serve. The question before us is not just about what happened that day, but about how many times it happened before. How many times it was ignored. How many times you were protected instead of held accountable." Briggs swallowed, his lips parting as if to speak, but Aisha continued. "For years, men like you have operated under the assumption that justice does not apply to you. That the weight of the law only crushes those without a badge. That accountability is something for others, never for you. That belief has allowed you to move through this world with impunity, never stopping to consider what would happen if, one day, the tables turned. And now they have." She let the words sink in, let them hang there, undeniable, inescapable. "You looked at me that day and believed I was beneath you. You believed you had the right to put your hands on me, to humiliate me, because you never even considered the possibility that the woman you tried to degrade was the same one who would hold your future in her hands. But here we are." Briggs clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to scream. He wanted to deny it all. But what could he say? The cameras had seen. The witnesses had spoken. The truth had been laid bare, and no amount of denial could undo it. Aisha's eyes locked onto his. "You are not above the law. Not anymore." The room was silent, save for the furious scribbling of reporters documenting every word. Then, with deliberate slowness, she lifted the gavel. Briggs' breath hitched, his entire body bracing for the final blow. And then, she brought it down. And the entire world heard it. The gavel's impact echoed through the courtroom like the final note of a song that had been building for far too long. The weight of it settled into the walls, reverberated through the polished wooden benches, rippled through the bodies seated inside. It was not just a sound. It was a declaration. A shift. A moment in time that could never be undone. Officer Daniel Briggs was no longer in control. He sat at the defendant's table, shoulders tense, his face locked in a grimace that he no longer had the strength to mask. The once arrogant gleam in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something raw, something dangerously close to fear. He had been trying to convince himself, up until the very last second, that the world would still bend for him, that the system that had always shielded him would find a way to save him one more time. But now, with the sound of that gavel ringing in his ears, he knew. There would be no escape. The room was unbearably silent, as if the very air had thickened. Aisha Carter's gaze was locked onto Briggs, unwavering, unreadable. Her presence commanded the room without effort, without force, simply by the sheer weight of what had brought them here. She had waited for this moment, not out of vengeance, not out of personal satisfaction, but out of necessity. This was bigger than her, bigger than him, bigger than the countless times he had been allowed to walk away while others suffered the consequences of his actions. She had to ensure that this time was different. Briggs shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. His lawyer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and an expression that had darkened considerably over the past few weeks, leaned in, whispering something urgent, something Briggs barely registered. The words didn't matter. Nothing mattered now except the weight of what was coming. Judge Carter finally spoke, her voice even but powerful, carrying through the room like a force of nature. "Officer Briggs," she said, deliberately using his title one last time, as if to remind him of everything he had been given, of everything he had misused. "This court has heard the evidence against you. We have reviewed the footage. We have listened to testimony after testimony. And we have seen, clearly, the pattern. This is not about one moment of misconduct. This is not about a misunderstanding. This is about power abused, justice ignored, lives damaged beyond repair." Briggs' jaw clenched, his fingers twitching against the edge of the table. He wanted to fight back, to say something, to deny, to argue. But the words refused to come. He could feel the weight of every single eye in the room fixed on him, waiting, watching, judging. Aisha leaned slightly forward, her gaze piercing. "Do you have anything to say before sentencing is delivered?" Briggs' lips parted, 1,000 different defenses rushing forward, none of them good enough. His throat was dry, his palms damp. He swallowed hard, glancing around the room, searching for something, anything, that might shift the balance in his favor. He found nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of the confidence, the arrogance, the assuredness he had always carried. This is all political," he muttered, the words hollow even as they left his mouth. "They wanted to make an example out of me." A scoff rippled through the audience, someone shaking their head in disbelief, someone else muttering under their breath. Briggs ignored it, his breathing uneven, his face growing redder. "I spent years on the force doing my job, following orders, keeping the damn streets safe, and now, suddenly, I'm the villain." His eyes darted to the jury, to the prosecution, to her. "For what? For a mistake. That's what this is, isn't it? A damn mistake." Aisha did not look away. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice colder now, sharper. "Is that what you call years of misconduct? Dozens of complaints, all brushed aside? Is that what you call the victims who sat in this very room and spoke about what you did to them? Tell me, Officer Briggs, how many mistakes should a person be allowed to make before they are held accountable?" Briggs' mouth opened, then closed. His lawyer subtly pressed a hand to his arm, as if signaling him to stop talking, to let it go. But Briggs couldn't. His entire existence was unraveling in real time, and he had never known how to accept defeat. He had never been forced to. He shook his head, barely above a whisper now. "This is wrong." Aisha inhaled, exhaled, steady as ever. "No, Officer Briggs. What you did was wrong. And today, this court ensures that you face the consequences of that wrongdoing." Another silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. Aisha turned slightly, addressing the room now. "This case is not just about one officer. It is about the very foundation of trust that is required for justice to function. The people must be able to trust that those who enforce the law are not above it. That when an officer abuses their power, there will be consequences. That the badge is not a shield for misconduct." Briggs' chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing uneven. He wanted to look strong, but he felt his strength slipping. He felt the weight of everything he had done pressing down on him, and for the first time in his life, he realized he could not shake it off. Aisha's gaze locked onto his once more. "The sentence will reflect the severity of your actions. The lives you have harmed. The power you have abused. And the justice that, for too long, was denied to those who stood against you." The prosecutor spoke then, laying out the final recommendation for sentencing. Years behind bars. Real time. Real consequences. Briggs barely heard it. His mind was drowning, his ears ringing. Then, Aisha lifted the gavel again, and in that final moment, in that single second before she brought it down once more, Briggs realized something he had never considered before. He had never been untouchable. He had only been lucky. And his luck had finally run out. The gavel fell, the sound shattering through the courtroom. And this time, Daniel Briggs was the one being sentenced. The weight of the verdict settled over the courtroom like a heavy fog, thick and unrelenting. The sound of the gavel's impact still lingered in the air, reverberating not just in the walls but in the bones of every person who had witnessed it. The moment had been sealed, undeniable, irreversible. Daniel Briggs had been sentenced. The words had been spoken, the judgment delivered, and yet, the silence that followed felt almost louder than the ruling itself. The people who had spent years watching men like him evade consequences were now witnessing what many had thought impossible. A man who had wielded the system to his advantage for so long was finally facing the weight of the very justice he had once dismissed as something meant only for others. Briggs sat there, his body stiff, his face a mask of barely concealed rage and disbelief. His entire world had just collapsed in real time, and yet, he still sat as if he were waiting for something, some miracle, some last-minute reversal that would never come. His mind was spinning, his thoughts disjointed, scrambling to make sense of how he had gotten here. He had been untouchable. At least, that was what he had always believed. But now, the badge that had once shielded him from accountability had been reduced to nothing more than a hollow emblem of the power he had lost. The courtroom did not erupt into applause. There were no cheers, no celebratory outbursts. The atmosphere was too thick, too layered with history, too significant for something as simple as triumph. Justice, when delivered correctly, did not come with victory laps. It came with reckoning, with the weight of understanding that this was not the end of something, but the beginning of a shift. A shift in the system, a shift in expectations, a shift in what people now knew was possible. Aisha Carter remained seated at her bench, her expression unreadable but her presence still commanding the room. She had not flinched, not wavered, not allowed herself the luxury of celebrating what had happened here today. Because while this was a moment of accountability, it was not enough. It would never be enough. One case, one officer, one conviction, it did not undo the years of unchecked power, of lives disrupted, of trust broken. But it was a start. And in a world where justice often felt like an illusion, a start was something. Briggs' attorney leaned in, whispering something urgently in his ear, but he barely registered the words. His focus was locked on the realization that no matter what was said next, no matter what legal technicalities they might try to argue in the coming weeks, this was real. He could not undo it. His past had finally caught up with him, and the world had watched as it swallowed him whole. The judge's voice cut through the silence once more, steady, unwavering. This courtroom will now recess. The defendant will be taken into custody immediately. Briggs' breath hitched, the word striking him like a physical blow. Taken into custody. The phrase echoed in his skull, bouncing off the walls of his mind, refusing to settle. The doors at the side of the courtroom opened, and uniformed officers stepped forward, their faces neutral but their presence undeniable. He saw the shift in their eyes, the way some of them recognized him, the way they understood that this was not just another prisoner, but a former peer now being placed on the other side of the bars. Briggs' hands clenched into fists. He had walked these halls as an enforcer of the law, as the one who decided who was guilty, who was dangerous, who needed to be handled with force. And now he was the one being removed, the one being led away in front of the same people who once feared him. The realization twisted in his gut like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. The moment his wrists were grabbed, the cold steel of handcuffs clicking into place, everything broke. No, he breathed, the word escaping before he could stop it, before he could swallow the panic that had begun to rise. His voice was low, barely audible, but desperate. No, you can't do this. You can't, one of the officers tightened his grip. Stand up. Briggs remained frozen, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. His mind was still trying to reject what was happening, to process how quickly the power dynamics had shifted. He had been in their position before. He had stood over men in these same chairs, had placed cuffs on them with the same impassive stare, had dragged them from the courtroom without a second thought. But he had never considered what it felt like to be on the other side. Now he knew. Aisha watched him carefully, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her gaze, something that acknowledged the weight of this moment, that saw it for what it truly was. A full-circle reckoning. Briggs turned to her then, his eyes locking onto hers, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Please. You can't send me in there. You know what they'll do to me." The room remained silent, the air thick with expectation. Aisha did not react immediately. She let the words settle, let the gravity of the moment fully sink into him before she spoke. "This is justice, Officer Briggs." Her voice was steady, firm, carrying no malice, no satisfaction, just truth. "The same justice you denied to so many." Briggs' face contorted, not just with fear but with something dangerously close to realization. It was over. The officers pulled him up from his seat, guiding him toward the doors. His movements were sluggish, almost reluctant, as though the act of walking toward his fate would make it real in a way it hadn't been before. As he reached the threshold, he turned back one last time, as if hoping to see a lifeline, some last opportunity to rewrite what had already been decided. But there was none. As the doors closed behind him, the courtroom let out a collective breath, a silent exhale of something that had been held for too long. The reporters scribbled furiously, the attorneys exchanged glances, the public defenders in the room sat a little straighter, knowing that this case would be remembered. Aisha sat there for a moment longer, unmoving, her thoughts unreadable. This was what justice looked like, what it was supposed to be. And yet, it did not feel like victory. Because she knew the battle was not over. It was never over. One man being held accountable did not fix the system that allowed him to act without consequence for so long. It did not erase the pain of those who had suffered under his abuse. It did not undo the years of silence that had let men like him thrive. But it was a start. She stood from her bench, her presence still commanding, her expression still firm. There was still so much work to do. But for today, justice had spoken. And the world had been forced to listen. The weight of the moment had not yet lifted. The echoes of the gavel still seemed to reverberate through the walls of the courthouse, lingering in the high ceilings, weaving themselves into the very foundation of the building. The courtroom was still, almost unnaturally so, as though the air itself had thickened, pressing down on those who remained inside. The people seated in the benches, attorneys, clerks, journalists, public defenders, family members of the victims, quiet spectators who had come in search of some semblance of justice, were still processing the magnitude of what had just taken place. It was as if time had momentarily slowed, stretching the silence, allowing each person to sit with the reality of what had just transpired. A man who had spent his career evading accountability had finally been caught in the grip of justice. And yet, despite the significance of this moment, despite the undeniable shift that had occurred, there was no eruption of applause, no triumphant celebration. There was only the quiet hum of recognition, the unspoken understanding that this, while monumental, was not a victory, it was merely the first step in a fight that had always been bigger than just one man. Aisha Carter remained seated at the bench, her hands steady, her posture unyielding, her gaze unreadable. From the outside, she appeared as she always had, calm, composed, a pillar of unwavering authority, but beneath the surface, she felt the weight of what had just taken place settle deep into her bones. She had known that this day would come, had prepared for it, had anticipated every possible reaction, every potential outcome. And yet, now that it had happened, now that Briggs had been sentenced, there was no satisfaction in it. There was no catharsis. There was only the understanding that while this was a moment of reckoning, it was not enough. It would never be enough. Because one conviction did not undo the damage that had already been done. One trial did not erase the years of unchecked abuse. One sentencing did not repair the broken trust between the system and the people it was supposed to serve. She allowed herself a single, measured breath before she finally rose to her feet, her movements slow, deliberate. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room following her, waiting for her next move, anticipating what came next. The murmurs had already begun to ripple through the crowd, hushed voices whispering urgently to one another, people exchanging glances, some filled with relief, others with skepticism. Journalists scribbled furiously into their notebooks, their fingers flying across keyboards, their minds already forming the headlines that would spread beyond these walls. This case would not be forgotten. This moment would not fade. The conviction of Officer Daniel Briggs was not just another courtroom proceeding, it was a message, a statement, a declaration that the rules had changed, that those who had once operated above the law were no longer untouchable. As Aisha stepped down from the bench, the tension in the room shifted slightly, a subtle but noticeable change. People began to move, slowly at first, as though unsure whether they should speak, whether they should break the silence that had held them captive for so long. Attorneys gathered their papers, court clerks exchanged quiet words, and yet, despite the slow return to motion, there was still a charge in the air, an undeniable sense that something irreversible had just taken place. She made her way toward the exit with the same steady, measured pace she always carried, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step deliberate, each movement calculated. She knew that the weight of this moment extended beyond the courtroom. The city was watching. The world was watching. Just as she reached the door, a voice cut through the hum of conversation, firm yet quiet enough to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Captain Mark Ellis. A man who had spent years balancing the impossible tightrope between loyalty to his officers and the undeniable reality of the corruption that had festered within the department. His face was unreadable, his mouth pressed into a firm line, his posture stiff with the kind of tension that came from knowing that a storm was already brewing. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the urgency in it as he stepped closer, lowering his tone even further. "You know this isn't over." The words carried weight, an unspoken warning woven into them, a quiet reminder that justice, even when delivered, did not come without consequence. Aisha met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unwavering. "No, Captain. It's only just begun." There was no fear in her voice, no hesitation, no uncertainty. She knew exactly what this case meant. She knew that convicting a police officer, especially one like Briggs, would come with repercussions. She had never been naive about how this world worked, had never believed that accountability would come without resistance. But she also knew that the only way to break the cycle was to refuse to back down. Ellis exhaled through his nose, his fingers flexing slightly at his sides, as though debating whether to say more. Finally, he huffed a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You made a lot of enemies today." Aisha tilted her head slightly, studying him, her expression never shifting. "Did I?" He let out another breath, shaking his head slightly. "You know how this works. A conviction like this? On a case like his? They won't forget it." There was something almost resigned in his voice, something that suggested he had seen this play out before, that he had watched the system retaliate against those who dared to challenge it. Aisha didn't blink. "Good." Ellis let the silence stretch between them for a moment longer before finally nodding, stepping aside, allowing her to pass. The moment she stepped outside, the noise hit her like a wave. The courthouse steps were filled with people, protesters and reporters, activists and onlookers, all gathered in anticipation of this moment. The chants were loud, a mix of triumph and exhaustion, voices calling for justice, for change, for something more. Signs were held high, their messages clear, bold, unapologetic. Some faces were alight with hope. Others were lined with the hardened expectation that this was not the end of the fight, it was only the beginning. Aisha moved through the crowd with the same steady grace she had carried inside the courtroom. Some people cheered. Others simply watched, their eyes filled with questions that only time could answer. She reached the waiting car, the driver already holding the door open. But before she stepped inside, she turned back, letting herself take in the sight before her. The courthouse loomed behind her, an institution that had existed long before she had ever taken the bench, and one that would remain long after she was gone. But today, for once, it had done what it was meant to do. Today, it had stood on the right side of history. As she scanned the crowd, her eyes locked onto a young woman near the front, a girl no older than 20, her hands clutching a sign that read, "Justice must not be the exception. It must be the rule." Aisha met her gaze and gave a single nod. Then, she stepped into the car, closing the door behind her. Outside, the city kept moving. Because the fight was far from over. The car moved through the streets of Baltimore, cutting through the heavy night air like a slow-moving specter, its presence unnoticed by most, yet undeniably significant to those who understood what had just unfolded. The world outside was alive, neon lights flickering against the wet pavement, distant sirens wailing like echoes of the justice system that had just been shaken at its core, the hum of the city a constant reminder that life never truly paused, no matter how monumental a single moment might feel. But inside the vehicle, there was nothing but silence, thick and suffocating, wrapping around the space like an invisible force pressing against the very air they breathed. Aisha Carter sat in the back seat, her posture composed, her face unreadable, but inside, the weight of everything pressed against her ribs, tightening, constricting, not in the form of fear, but in the form of awareness. She had done what many had thought impossible. She had sat on that bench, stared down the remnants of a system that had long protected men like Briggs, and she had not blinked. She had watched as the law, a force so often manipulated to serve the powerful, had finally turned inward, finally held one of its own accountable, finally spoken for those who had never been heard. And yet, despite the finality of the gavel, despite the sentence that had been handed down with undeniable weight, she knew that this was not the end. This was merely the beginning of a different battle, a battle that had already started the moment she walked out of that courtroom, the moment her name became synonymous with defiance, with disruption, with change that was never meant to happen. Her driver, a man who had worked for the courts long enough to recognize the patterns of power and consequence, was tense. His grip on the wheel was tight, his knuckles white against the black leather, his shoulders stiff in a way that spoke of instinct, of knowing when the atmosphere around you had shifted into something dangerous. Aisha noticed the way his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror more often than usual, the way his breathing was just slightly more controlled, as if each inhale and exhale was an exercise in preparation. She didn't need to ask what he had already figured out. She felt it too. They were being followed. She kept her voice calm, measured, unwavering. How long? The driver's response came after a pause, his voice just as steady, but carrying the underlying tension of a man who knew that acknowledging a threat made it real. Since we pulled out of the courthouse. They're not backing off. Aisha shifted her gaze slightly, just enough to catch the black SUV trailing them in the distance, not too close, but close enough to make its presence known. This was not a mistake. This was not coincidence. This was a message. They weren't trying to force anything, not yet. They wanted her to see them, wanted her to understand that there were eyes on her, that every move she made was being tracked, that the scales of justice did not tip without consequence. She exhaled slowly, pressing her fingertips together in thought before speaking again, her voice never rising, never betraying the pulse of adrenaline beginning to stir in her chest. Lose them. The driver nodded once, and without hesitation, he took the next turn sharper than necessary, maneuvering down a side street that was less crowded, a route that would test whether the SUV was merely observing or if they were hunting. The moment the turn was complete, the answer was clear. The SUV followed. Aisha felt the shift, the moment her driver's breathing changed just slightly, the moment the tension in the car became something heavier, something sharper, something undeniable. They weren't just watching. They were waiting. Another turn, faster this time, another shift into a less obvious route. And yet, they remained. The SUV's presence did not falter, did not waver. They weren't in a hurry. They weren't here to attack. They were here to remind her that she had changed something, and that changes like this came with a cost. It was only when the car neared a more public space, a well-lit district filled with cameras, with pedestrians, with people who would see, that the SUV finally began to fall back. Aisha watched in silence as their shadow melted into traffic, disappearing as if it had never been there. But she knew better. It had been there. And it would be there again. When the car finally rolled to a stop outside her home, the driver hesitated, his fingers still gripping the wheel as though he expected to be asked to keep driving, to keep circling, to delay the moment when she would be alone, when she would be exposed. He turned slightly, his voice quieter now, the concern in it no longer just professional but human. "Do you want me to stay?" Aisha offered him the smallest of smiles, the kind that was meant to reassure but carried no real warmth, no real ease. "No. But thank you." The driver gave a short nod, but his hesitation remained. She didn't blame him. He had seen enough to understand that this was more than a courtroom case. This was a disruption to something bigger, something deeper, something that had never been meant to shift. As she stepped inside, locking the door behind her, the silence of her home wrapped around her like a heavy coat, familiar yet somehow altered. She moved through the space with the ease of someone who had lived there for years, but tonight, the walls felt thinner, the shadows heavier, the air carrying an unspoken warning. She exhaled, pressing her fingers to her temples for a moment, allowing herself the rare luxury of stillness, of feeling. The exhaustion was creeping in now, slow but undeniable, a reminder that even the strongest foundations could crack under enough pressure. Then, the vibration against the wooden table shattered the moment. Her phone. The sharp hum cut through the silence like a blade, drawing her back to the present, back to the reality of what she had just done, of what she had set in motion. She reached for it, her fingers steady despite the tension wrapping around her spine, lifting the screen to reveal a single message. No name. No number. Just words. "You've made a mistake." She stared at the screen for a long moment, not out of fear, not out of uncertainty, but out of a deep, unwavering acknowledgement of what this meant. Then, without hesitation, without reaction, she deleted the message and placed the phone back down. She had spent her entire life preparing for moments like this. And if they thought intimidation would break her, they had underestimated the woman they had tried to silence. Let them come. She was ready. The days that followed were filled with an eerie stillness, the kind that lingered in the aftermath of a storm, when the damage had been done but the dust had yet to settle. The city had not forgotten. The courtroom had been emptied, the reporters had moved on to their next scandal, and yet, the echoes of what had happened still reverberated through the streets, in the hushed conversations at coffee shops, in the glances exchanged between officers who now had to reckon with the idea that they, too, could fall. The conviction of Daniel Briggs was not just a moment, it was a shift, a reminder that power was not absolute, that the shield of authority was not impenetrable, that justice, however rarely, could still strike back. Briggs himself had not spoken since the verdict. He had been escorted from the courthouse, his head lowered, his expression blank, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the war raging inside of him. He had spent his entire life believing in his own invincibility, convinced that men like him would always land on their feet, that the system would always bend to protect its own. But now, as he sat in a prison cell, stripped of his badge, of his authority, of the very identity that had once defined him, the reality of his situation settled in like a slow, suffocating weight. He was not feared here. He was not respected. He was just another inmate, surrounded by men whose lives he had once controlled, whose fates he had decided with the flick of a pen or the press of a knee. And they had not forgotten. There was no redemption arc waiting for him, no last-minute twist of fate to save him from the consequences of his actions. The officers who had once called him their brother now kept their distance, some out of indifference, others out of something closer to satisfaction. He had been their symbol of unchecked power, their reminder that the rules did not apply to them. But now, with his conviction, he was something else entirely. A warning. A precedent. A glimpse into what could happen if they went too far. And for the first time in his life, Briggs felt what it was like to be powerless. Outside those prison walls, the city moved forward, but it did not forget. The department was under review. Complaints that had once been buried were now being unearthed, cases reopened, patterns exposed. The ruling had forced hands that had spent decades resisting change. And though there was still resistance, though the system did not break overnight, cracks had begun to form. For Aisha Carter, the days following the trial were filled with meetings, interviews, threats both spoken and unspoken. The message was clear: she had stepped out of line. But she had never been one to follow a path simply because it was expected. She had spent her entire life defying those who believed she didn't belong, who thought they could silence her through intimidation or bureaucracy. This was no different. She stood before the press, before the cameras, before the people who still doubted whether justice had truly been served, and she spoke with the same conviction that had carried her through the trial. This is not about one case. This is about accountability. About ensuring that no one is above the law, not a politician, not a CEO, and not a police officer. If this ruling makes you uncomfortable, then perhaps you should ask yourself why. Her words spread like wildfire, igniting conversations, forcing those who had once turned a blind eye to finally see. The threats did not stop. The warnings did not cease. But neither did she. She continued to fight. She continued to push. And in doing so, she became something more than just a judge. She became a symbol of what justice could be if people refused to accept silence. As for the system itself, it did not crumble overnight. It did not magically transform. But it had been shaken. And in that shaking, doors had been opened, voices had been heard, and a precedent had been set. The fight was not over. It would never be over. But for the first time in a long time, it felt as though something had truly changed. And so, as Aisha Carter walked through the courthouse, head held high, the echoes of her footsteps trailing behind her, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she had no intention of stopping. Now, let me ask you this: how many times have we watched injustices play out with no consequences? How many times have we seen those in power walk away untouched, protected by the very system meant to hold them accountable? And how many times have we told ourselves that nothing will change? But today, you heard a story where something did change. Where the weight of justice finally fell on the right side of the scales. So tell me, if this were the real world, would you believe it? Or would you assume that power would once again protect itself? Justice should never be a rare occurrence. It should never be an anomaly. But for many, it is. And the question is, what will it take for that to change? If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, if it made you question the way the world works, then you're exactly where you need to be. Here at Tales of Twist, we bring you the stories that challenge perspectives, that push boundaries, that remind us of what justice should look like. If you want more stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, that make you question everything you thought you knew, then make sure to subscribe and stay with us for the next one. Because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.